blue hydrogen matter? We've talked a lot about it today, but I really want to hone in on some of the environmental justice impacts today. And I think a big piece of it is we're seeing some of the same political and industrial actors that have been very powerful and prominent stakeholders in the fossil fuel industry working to bring this type of hydrogen production to our state. And as a result, we're seeing some very specific risks on the life cycle. I really appreciated David's presentation earlier talking about looking at life cycle analysis and really understanding both the downstream and the upstream impacts of this energy source. And so I really want to build on that too, highlighting different aspects of this life cycle risk on our communities. And so the first would be, we're going to see an increased demand for gas, oil and gas. As a result, we're going to then see more hydraulic fracturing, which is going to use a chemical mix like PFAS to be injected into the ground and fracture the geology and capture that methane and generate a radioactive byproduct. So essentially, we're going to see an increased use of chemical mixes, and how that will affect our water is going to be a risk to us as well. I mean, we've seen in the past year a lot of talk about PFAS chemicals in our drinking water across the entire country. West Virginia has dozens and dozens of water systems that have PFAS in their raw drinking water, and so in communities, especially where fracking occurs, there's going to be a risk of more PFAS in their water. We're going to see, which I think will be talked about a little later, the construction of many miles of pipelines to transport and sequester this carbon. There's going to be all of the environmental justice impacts that come with pipeline production. And then finally, we're going to see worsened health, water, climate, and community impacts throughout this life cycle. So today I'm going to really focus first on the air and climate impacts, then on some of the environmental justice impacts, and on the health and the water impacts. So we're going to break them down into categories, but understand going into all of these different types of impacts that there's some overlap. So, some of the issues with our water or air is absolutely going to affect public health because we live in such an interconnected environment. The first risk, which has been touched on today too, is methane. As we see more drilling for oil and gas, we're going to see more methane leaks. It's released during fracking, and it's also leaks during the hydrogen production process. We know from studies done by organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund and by other academic institutions across the country that oil and gas supply chain emissions are actually much higher than those estimated by the Department of Energy and the EPA. And we're seeing this now a lot as the EPA is looking to finalize their methane rule, that these emissions are much higher than projected. So we will see that as we see oil and gas become a feedstock into blue hydrogen. Even more, we've touched on this, so I won't go too deep into it, but carbon dioxide capture and storage has risks of using unproven technology. We have the risk of raising electricity costs, and then also the risk of additional pollution from leaks. I mean, we're seeing that in practice, CCS is not actually reaching this 95+% capture rate, and as a result, that means there's going to be an increased number of leaks if it's not achieving that. Additionally, we're seeing in terms of air impacts that some studies have shown that there's even a larger carbon footprint in the entire life cycle of producing blue hydrogen. That's actually upwards of 20% larger than that of just the general process of natural gas and coal. And it's over 60% larger than that of diesel oil when it's used for heat. So as a result, this carbon footprint and in contribution to anthropogenic climate change is just going to increase as we build out blue hydrogen development projects. And as we know, the fundamental cause, acknowledged by 99+% of scientists, is that burning fossil fuels contributes to climate change. So, and it's also been made clear by two large international bodies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, as well as even the International Energy Agency, which was a national government organization, a non-governmental organization formed out of the oil crisis in the 80s, and as a response to to supporting oil development, they've even said that we can't see new oil, gas, and coal development if we want to meet any 2050 goals for climate change. So, building off of some of those air and climate impacts, I want to touch a little bit on specifically some environmental justice impacts of blue hydrogen. We're going to see the health risks of all of these different inputs to blue hydrogen. We're going to see those health risks exacerbate. We're also going to see more damages to local economies associated with fracking operations in our region. Specifically in West Virginia, communities in north central West Virginia have been disproportionately impacted by public health concerns associated with exposure to gas production and waste and chemical byproducts. And after hydrogen production, the carbon byproduct that needs to be captured and stored that makes it blue hydrogen also poses the risk that Sean talked about a lot earlier with the economic risks of driving up electric bills, assuming it's used for power production, as we've seen some proposals in West Virginia for that. And so that creates also direct pollution risks from that leakage. I think when we talk about environmental justice, especially with the intersections of health risks as well, we talk a lot about the electricity costs or the increased cost of production on communities. And at least from a West Virginia context, over the past decade, we've seen our electricity bills by Appalachian Electric Power go up 150%. I've talked personally with people in communities that sometimes have to choose between buying their insulin and paying their electricity bill. This, as a result, shows this direct intersection of the economic risks of this project and how it becomes this now justice issue, or health justice issue. And as we're seeing across any sort of extractive project, some of the most extreme impacts from any type of fossil fuel infrastructure, whether it's fracking, the carbon capture and storage, tends to often be localized in low-income communities or communities of color, which exacerbates the injustices we've seen across our country. So to build a little bit on specifically health, we've talked about how this could increase fracking, and it will increase the exposure of the public to different dangerous chemicals. So the chemicals used in fracking are proprietary or trade secret. So, and different studies have shown that these chemicals can include toxic substances like PFAS, and so, and also radioactive waste byproducts. And these are extremely hazardous to public health. These chemicals are known to be toxic and damaging to human health, even in very tiny concentrations. But currently, the industry isn't required to report the amount or types of PFAS used. Even more we see with fracking, fracking creates ethane, which is a building block for plastic production. And so we're seeing, especially in the Ohio River Valley and in the petrochemical buildout in the valley, how every stage of the plastics life cycle is hazardous, whether it's the transportation of these chemicals to the production of them. This also feeds into higher cancer risks in counties that have these petrochemical facilities and also fracking. So according to research done by Ohio River Valley Institute, there's over 100% of the counties that have fracking in West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania have greater than 1 in 1 million cancer risk, which is above the EPA's level of concern for cancer risk. So if the development of these hydrogen projects results in an increase in fracking, we're going to see likely higher cancer risks in those specific communities. And across the country, less than 8% of other counties even have that same level of risk, which is quite concerning. And then finally, I just want to give a brief overview of some of these water impacts that we might see in the life cycle of blue hydrogen. So, as we mentioned, radioactive waste can be created from fracking, along with more hazardous chemicals. And so these are often injected or stored underground or in landfills. And so that creates a risk of leaking into the watershed. And so as a result, that can contaminate our surface water or groundwater. Additionally, in transports or accidents, such as spills. Even more, we see methane infiltration from hydrocarbon wells into aquifers can further degrade the local watershed and drinking water sources. So they can pose a combustion risk. Even more, they can precede the presence of volatile organic compounds, which are detrimental to our health and also associated with higher oil and gas productions. And then finally, as we talk about the infrastructure build out and its impact on water, whether it's pipelines or carbon injection wells, we're going to see significant earth disturbance, which has been touched on earlier. So that comes with water quality threats, whether it's stream crossings or erosion. We've seen with a different type of pipeline, with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, we've seen the number of violations that occur when stream crossings have to occur with this scale of build out. And with something as unprecedented as carbon dioxide pipelines, we're going to see even more threats to our water quality as this build out occurs. So with that, I won't go too deep into this because we've touched a lot on ARCH 2 earlier with Tom. But I work for West Virginia Environmental Organization, so very much thinking through the West Virginia context. And as we're watching all of these different projects develop with the ARCH 2 Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub, building out in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, it's become clear that renewables is not a feedstock, and we've seen that in their what's been presented about their application. And as we wait to find out what's going to happen with that application, we're already seeing, as mentioned before, development occur throughout the valley, whether it's the forgivable loan presented to Fidelis just a few weeks ago by the Economic Development Authority to build out a hydrogen project in Mason County, or the Nucor steel mill that's also in Mason County, a lot of overlap of these projects, to the injection of carbon dioxide in pore space in our state forests and protected areas. We've seen, as said before, that our state's already preparing for it as if it's a done deal. And so a number of these health, water, air, and environmental justice risks are already in play as we begin to see what's going to happen in the blue hydrogen landscape in our state. So this final slide, I just want to touch on, whether it's a decision maker, a citizen, a community member, the media, I just really want to emphasize looking at the life cycle impacts to our health, to our water, our climate, our air, our communities, and understanding that these systems are not just isolated to where they're constructed. They have upstream and downstream impacts that are more than just their singular inputs and outputs. And so it's really important to look at the different protections that can be made, protect our communities, and work toward community engagement, which I think will be touched on a little later, to really ensure that communities are benefiting the most from what projects occur, if any, in this field. So with that, I'll pause because I know there's other panelists to speak, but there's my contact information. I can give you all a card later if anyone wants to chat more.
Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Tom Schuster. I am the director of the Sierra Club Pennsylvania chapter. I'm going to talk a little bit about both CCS and hydrogen at the risk of kind of conflating the two, just because they are related. And I'll start by saying that we're not, as a Sierra Club, we're not opposed to either of them outright. but the applications, for the reasons that we've already heard, should be very limited and strategic, because if they're done poorly, we run the risk of actually exacerbating the climate crisis rather than solving it, and creating a whole new category of environmental injustice. So, to start, I was recently on a strategic group within the Sierra Club and kind of talked about revising our CCS policy, and it was a pretty spirited debate. I think we were looking at folks who are kind of climate hawks, people who think that CCS is not necessary under any circumstance. But I think it's really become clear that we've very much failed to address the climate crisis within the time frame that we really need to, and we're over a safe level of CO2 already in the atmosphere. And so it's becoming apparent that some level of CO2 removal is going to be necessary to really stabilize the climate. And it's not clear at all whether natural sinks are going to be enough. For example, we've all seen the effects of the Canadian wildfires this summer, and there's some studies that indicate that the entire Canadian boreal forest is soon to be, if not already, a CO2 source rather than a CO2 sink. And so there's a lot of concern that we are going to have to be investing somewhere down the line in things like direct air capture to take CO2 directly out, and so we have to deal with that somehow. And so I want to offer that as context for the rest of this, because it's not as simple as just saying like CCS is it's fraught with problems and therefore we should just not deal with it at all. But all that said, we do need to be careful about how we build out this system, because if we overbuild it, we create all kinds of problems. We overpay, as Sean and David have said earlier, we overpay to decarbonize. It creates ripple effects. It prevents us from actually decarbonizing and moving away from fossil fuels as quickly as we should. And we are exposing, in doing so, frontline communities that are already bearing the brunt of coal, oil, and gas pollution to more of the same. And then we have this new problem of CO2 pipelines that we've not really, we've dealt with pipelines, we've not dealt with CO2 pipelines. And originally, we were hoping to have Dan Ziger as part of this panel, who wrote the Gassing of Satartia article, which if you haven't read it yet, and I believe you've got a link to it in your packet, if there is a digital version of this, right? I think
Yes.
If you haven't read it yet, it's a spooky article. It's especially spooky if you listen to it on like something like Pocket, and they read it back to you in a robot voice while you're driving. We are kind of used to thinking about CO2 as being, a problem for the environment, but not especially toxic to humans. And the fact of the matter is, if we are exposed to it in the way that these pipelines can expose it to us, it very much is toxic. It's an asphyxiant that displaces oxygen in the air. And once you get up to approximately 4% concentration by volume, that's where OSHA classifies it as an immediate threat to life and health. These pipelines are under intense pressure. They can rupture, and when they do, even if you detect the leak right away, a lot of this stuff can escape before it stops leaking, right? And so what happened in Satartia is that we had a leak that took place over several hours, even though the company says that they detected it within minutes and shut it off. It was still causing impacts for people for hours. They were experiencing dizziness, confusion, headache. A lot of them didn't know what was happening. Nobody really knew what was going on. And you can pass out from it. The other thing that is really scary in terms of evacuation is, unless you're driving an electric vehicle, your engine shuts off because there's not enough oxygen to cause the fuel to combust. right? And this was happening for people who were trying to get out of town. This was happening for first responders who were trying to get in to help people. And in this case, to make matters worse, this was not CO2 that had been captured from flue gases. It was CO2 that was mined from a natural deposit being used for enhanced oil recovery. And as such, it had some hydrogen sulfide contamination in it. And so this CO2 actually smelled bad. It smelled like rotten eggs because of that hydrogen sulfide. And people think that that may be what's contributing to some of these chronic neurological problems that people have experienced. But it did at least give them a warning. Had it not been in there, and there are no regulations that require it to have any kind of artificial odors injected into it, it could have just been a silent killer. It could have just, everyone could have just died and no one would have known from the outside. So I'm gonna, in terms of like how people responded to that, I'm not gonna get too much into that. I think Latricea has some comments that she wants to give in terms of like the social factors surrounding that. But my point is that concentration of CO2 is not benign, and that's why overbuilding is going to be a serious environmental problem. And so what contributes to overbuilding is things like CCS deployment at power plants, right? We've heard about why that's economically a problem. From an environmental perspective, there is a significant parasitic load, which is the energy that it takes to run the equipment, means that you need 25 to 30% more fuel to actually produce the same amount of electricity that you're putting out onto the grid. That means that you have the potential to be emitting 25 to 30% more criteria pollutants like SO2, particulates, NOx, right? So even though you're capturing some percentage, we don't know exactly what percent of your CO2, you're going to potentially have air quality, serious negative air quality impacts, both locally and regionally, because some of these things travel quite a distance. And then in terms of if you're burning hydrogen directly, right, so that's a compliance pathway through the federal proposed CO2 regs. People think of hydrogen as a clean fuel, zero emission. You hear that phrase a lot in conjunction with hydrogen. That's only if you use it in a fuel cell. If you're combusting it, the NOx emission rates of hydrogen are 6 times worse than methane. Right, so you're going to have, if you have subsidized hydrogen combustion and power plants, you're going to have increased NOx emissions that are going to contribute to ozone problems. And the same reason, for that same reason, it's problematic for use in heating buildings, right? Or using in your cook stove, right? Appliances aren't even designed to use this right now. If they are retooled to be able to use that, you're still going to have problems of indoor air pollution, which are already pretty bad with methane and would be worse with hydrogen. Not to mention the fact that the properties of hydrogen make it actually more explosive than methane. It's easier to ignite. And yes, you have a question.
Hydrogen doesn't burn. You can't see hydrogen burning. The way the military discovered it was somebody was cleaning up with a broom, discovered a big hydrogen leak, and all of a sudden the end of the broom caught into fire.
Wow.
Burst into flames. So that's another risk, especially with home heating.
Yeah, and they say that I mean, we don't know, we don't have direct experience with this, but it's anticipated that your number of household explosions would be about quadrupled if you had widespread blending of hydrogen in buildings. So, so we know what not to do with it. What are some things that we think we could be exploring the use of CCS and hydrogen? So, cement production is one. Cement, if it were a country, right? The cement industry would be the 3rd largest emitter of CO2 in the world, behind the US and China. It's 8% of global CO2 emissions. And that's a chemical process emission. That is not emissions from burning fuel to make cement. It's emissions from converting calcium carbonate to lime, or limestone to lime. And so you either stop making cement, you find things that can substitute for cement, which is going to be difficult from a structural engineering standpoint, or you capture the CO2, right? And so I think that that we do actually need to look at ways to mitigate that source of residual emissions. And then the other one that I wanted to highlight, especially around here, is that hydrogen could replace coke in the steelmaking process, right? So we have the Clairton Coke Works in the Mon Valley. It's the largest coke plant in North America. And it's an outsized polluter of soot, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide, and benzene. And anyone who's been doing reporting around here is constantly noting violations, right? There was a recent lawsuit that cited 6,700 air permit violations over a 2.5-year period. And the community around Clairton is an environmental justice community. The asthma rates there are 4 times the national average. And so you can replace coke with hydrogen in the process of turning iron ore into steel. And I think that there's probably a case that you can make that for applications like that plant in Clairton, that residents around that area could be better off using hydrogen than using coke. Again, these are 2 examples. These are limited applications, they're targeted applications. But by and large, the process of transporting CO2, of storing CO2, we don't understand nearly enough about how it works, how it functions over the long term, and what the consequences are of things going wrong. So, so we need to be very careful in terms of how much that we build. And that is about all I have. I'll turn it over to you.
I'll be setting this up so when we offer silence. I'm Latricea Adams. I am the founder, CEO, and president of Millennials for Flint. We have very much so expanded. We started in the wake of the Flint water crisis, and we've worked in 4 core cities. Those 4 core cities, of course, Flint within our namesake, but also Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, and actually my hometown of Memphis in Tennessee. Tennessee is really interesting right now. But today I'm happy to speak on this topic specifically through the lens of community engagement. There'll be a little bit of overlap as it relates to environmental justice here as well.
Is that remote working? No. How about now?
What's that mean? Okay. So first, I'll speak about specifically how with community benefits, which specifically through the lens of the Department of Energy, they speak a lot about community benefits as that being kind of the conduit of how they're engaging with community stakeholders. But it's very much so absent of the 17 principles of environmental justice, and specifically the HEMES principles, which if you're talking about environmental justice, it absolutely should be grounded in those things, but it is not. Also, I'll speak to some of the limitations in research, specifically around environmental and public health risks. It'll be a little bit of overlap, so I'll try not to be redundant. And then also, what I like to call the power of informed people as we talk about the engagement from a community perspective. So this is small, but I'll just go over it in a nutshell. Are we all familiar with the 17 principles of EJ? Okay, somewhat. Okay. So quick little background around that. So the principles of environmental justice was actually established with the convening of people of color in the early 90s, where essentially with the environmental justice movement, this is the ways in which we should govern ourselves if we are engaged in this work. The principles, for the most part, is a perfect intersection between environment and the impacts of human beings. So now you mentioned this earlier around when we talk about environment, we have to think about it holistically. how we are interacting with the environment, and in turn, how the environment is reacting and interacting with us. And so with this principles, or with this set of principles, it really gets to the core of how we should govern our work around not just being good to the environment for environment's sake, but thinking about it holistically around how humans are engaged in that work as well. With the Hermes principles, and I'll go over this quickly, the Hermes principles is definitely parallel to the environmental justice principles, where essentially it outlines the way in which we should be engaging with community. We have learned very much so today that it is very top heavy. So a lot of these decisions didn't even grace the surface of engaging with community, but a lot of decisions were made from the top, completely devoid of engaging with community. So essentially with the Hermes principles, the first one, and we see that this has not been the case, is to be inclusive from beginning to end, the full cycle. The other component is emphasis on bottom-up organizing, meaning that at the point where this is even at the stage of idea creation, the community should have been engaged at that point. We know with this type of technology that did not happen, and I'll give some more examples a little bit later. And then also 3, let people speak for themselves. 4, working together in solidarity and mutuality. 5, building just relationships among ourselves. And then the 6th one is commitment to self-transformation. And so even as we listen to this language, we can see and match that it does not track what is happening with a lot of these technologies as it relates to community engagement. So big thing with community benefits. So with the Department of Energy, as they begin to roll out and deploy some of these projects, they keep using the terminology community benefit. But the issue here is who determined what those benefits were? It definitely was not community. Again, if we go back to the beginning, even looking at the Hermes principles, we should have been inclusive. So when we define what community benefits are, if community wasn't at the table to make that a decision, it's not a benefit. Who is it a benefit to? Definitely not to community. So going back to this, another key thing about even the language is when we say a community benefit, if there's something that could potentially cause harm, it is no longer a benefit. In fact, it indeed becomes counterproductive to what environmental justice is supposed to be. So for example, when the Department of Energy actually rolled out their plan around the full gamut of carbon, so not even just specific to hydrogen, they juxtaposed that with the Justice 40 initiative. Do you know what the Justice 40 initiative is? I'll go quick. So Justice 40 essentially states, and this comes from the Biden-Harris administration, that 40% of all investments as it relates to environment, based on the environmental executive order around climate that came out very early in the Biden-Harris administration, 40% of those benefits have to go to what is categorized as disadvantaged, there we go, not disenfranchised, but yes, that too, but disadvantaged communities. If that is the case, if any of these technologies that is, it's not enough research, we don't even know what those implications are, it is not a benefit if it in the slightest could impose harm on community members. So to go a little bit in depth around Justice 40, this actually came out of Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, so it speaks to that. Also with community benefits, this specifically, with any of these projects, the community benefits has a significant overview of how you should engage with community. But here's the thing. So with stakeholder consultation and stakeholder engagement, anybody could be a part of a community. You have people that are in industry. They live somewhere, right? They're still a part of a community. Are they representative and reflective of the communities that will actually be impacted? Maybe, maybe not. So there's a lot of ambiguity that exists with that. But then also, as it relates to benefits, and I don't want to be repetitive, but this is extremely important, who determines what is a benefit? From the inception stage, we are seeing that these benefits are not being defined by community. In addition to that, and I'll talk about this in greater depth, because a lot of these technologies, specifically around hydrogen, is so new and so nuanced, there hasn't been enough community education so that you do engage with community stakeholders, that they're even best informed, that they can make the best informed decisions because all of this is so new. Even in this room of experts, we still have a lot of room to grow, but I want to bet, and I even know firsthand, if we had a meeting or a convening like this in community, it would be complete gaps of understanding from a technology or technical perspective about what this is, and to presumably think that community members will be well equipped with limited knowledge to make a decision about if something should come into their backyards. All right, still staying on the topic of community benefits. So specifically based on guidance that came from the Department of Energy or DOE, it's still very unclear around what happens if a community says no. So great, we're talking about community benefits. Let's say a community's like, nope, I don't think that this is a community benefit. I don't want any of this in my backyard. It's still very unclear if that sets a precedence around if the technology will stop. Even right now, and I know earlier we heard about what some of the progress is in West Virginia, also in Ohio, but especially in places like Louisiana, you have extreme resistance already from community, but it's still going on with the application process, right? So it's very unclear around what power the people in community actually have. And when you ask this question, and this is not to disparage, it's just facts, when you ask these questions and pose these questions to the Department of Energy, it still goes unanswered around if the community says no, are you still going to do what you want to do anyway, right? The second part of this, and I mentioned this before, is when we say community stakeholder, it's still very loose. So for example, real life example, elected officials are also part of the community, right? And oftentimes with industry, we see this, especially with the fossil fuel industry, there's a lot of engagement with people who have political power. With some of these entities, they may on one hand be trying to get resources from the federal government to deploy projects, but they also have other political agendas. Oftentimes they have things such as PACs. So you start to see, you have on one hand where they're trying to engage the community, but then on the other hand, using other resources, still are in the pockets of politicians where they can greatly influence what comes into their districts, into their wards, which further disenfranchises the actual influence of community members that will be directly impacted. In addition to that, it also just speaks to, just for lack of better terms, it's pandering to community members. We've seen people who come into communities, they have novelty items, they have things to engage with children, they might invest and give money to like a community fair and all of these things that feel good and glittery inside, but at the same time could be very detrimental to that community. I'll use an example that's not a hydrogen example, but where I'm from in Memphis, have you all heard of the Byhalia pipeline and that was like shut down and all of that? Okay. So even with the Byhalia pipeline, what got very sticky is they started to give money to very under-resourced organizations. There's one civil rights organization, and I won't name them, that took some money from the Byhalia pipeline because they didn't understand how insidious it was. Essentially how the Byhalia pipeline folks set it up is said, you can use this pot of money so you can do community grants, and you can get these grants back to community-based organizations. That sounds like a win from a superficial perspective, but because community wasn't informed and educated in the best way, it set them up for something that was counterproductive to what is really needed and necessary for the community. So all of these things come into play. When we talk about benefit, a benefit to who? A benefit to industry, or is it truly a benefit to community members? Right. The other component is again, not to say I'm redundant, with hydrogen in particular, aside from not really knowing from a long-term or even short-term perspective what the public health and environmental risk implications are, it's also not really clear if this is a sustainable technology. So we don't even know how long this actually lasts. So let's say, for example, you did implement these technologies and it lasted for a particular amount of time. Do we know like what the upkeep is gonna be? I know earlier we heard around, even if a site is closed, you have 50 years to do this oversight and monitoring. What are the implications for that? What is the economic implications for that? And then also, another key thing that's often used as a tactic to engage with community is they pose this with job creation. So we have to be careful with that as well, because we don't know what the implications are from an employment perspective. What implications that may have on your public health, but literally being an employee. So when we talk about jobs, when you come into a community, what type of jobs are you actually offering? Are you gonna come into a community where you already have your C-suite and executive level staff that will be making 6 figures already figured out, and you're just gonna provide opportunities for low wages, and very labor-intensive positions, those are questions that oftentimes community members don't even have time to ask because all of the decisions have already been made by the time they connect with community. Another aspect of this that should be taken into consideration is just around the way in which these projects are rolled out. So because this funding is coming through the federal government, based on the executive order that's supposed to be addressing the climate crisis, they're using disadvantaged communities, the very essence of us talking about environmental justice, to experiment, because that's what it is, regardless of what euphemisms you try to use, it's unfound. We don't have enough information. So you literally use the recommendations from entities like the White House Environmental Advisory Council that developed this very robust understanding of what a disadvantaged community is, and literally use those vulnerable, overburdened communities to serve as test dummies for you to literally implement these technologies. You have no idea what impacts they're going to have into communities that are already overburdened by existing environmental issues. All right. Shifting gears a little bit to talk about some of the limitations on research as it relates to environmental and public health risks. And I don't want to sound redundant because I know we heard a little bit about this, but some key things that I want to tease away from this. Something that's really absent from this conversation is about body burden or cumulative health impacts. So everybody, regardless at this point in life, regardless of where you come from, you have some type of cumulative body burden. Whether you've been in places where there's been overwhelming air quality issues, where there's been water quality issues, even with extreme weather, a lot of those things have impacts on our bodies over time, from birth until current, right? On top of that, there are also, implications if you are a person of color, if you are a person that's from a background where you've experienced economic hardship, that makes you even more vulnerable. The issue with these technologies is, one, we don't know that they're safe, and two, we don't know exactly what type of health implications that they may have. In addition to that, when we talk about health, we already know that that is a growing issue that exists as it relates to equity within our country. So if you do have health issues, let's say that it's imposing on you your ability to even go to work and to make money, on top of there being potential implications around your healthcare accessibility and the quality of that healthcare accessibility. Also, something that is missing is co-pollutants. So we don't even know exactly to what degree, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, around some of the other things that could exacerbate existing environmental risks that exist into the community, and what that would look like, not just for the community itself, but its impact on human beings and also wildlife, animals that live in community as well with us. And then also the last thing that I will say is the lack of guidance around emergency preparedness. So we spoke a little bit around what happened in Satartia. That was a disaster, not just with the CO2 situation itself, but literally your healthcare professionals. How do you know how to treat someone that has been exposed to this level of CO2? We haven't seen this before. The implications that it had on staff, so your EMT folks, right? On your fire departments. No one is trained on how to deal with a CO2 explosion. And so keeping that in mind, this was a very small town, but think about with all of these technologies that could potentially roll out in different communities across the country, what is the preparedness for that? And where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with the actual person who will be governing this technology? Does it lie with the federal government? Does it go back to the state, local? It's still very unclear. And with this still rolling out, with this lack of clarity, is extremely problematic. And the last part that I'll say for this particular aspect, it's not enough research that really supports that this is even efficient, that it's even getting to the core of what this should all be about, is the reduction of CO2. We don't even know if these technologies will even exist in a way that will actually do just that. All right, so just specifically to touch a little bit more about Satartia. So some of these things that should be taken into consideration is who is at fault. So specifically in the issue with Satartia, when we talk about the recovery efforts, it's very much devoid of humans. It talks about the actual site itself, but not making the connection back to the human beings that were impacted when this explosion actually happened. And then also a key component that's missing is around the lack of education, right? So it was mentioned earlier that like no one knew what was going on, right? So no one knew what was going on. And then even in addition to that, just not even understanding like how this technology actually works. So it goes back to the point that I made, if we're asking community members if this is something that you want in your community, you don't have enough information to make the best informed decision. And the other component that I mentioned earlier is around body burden. Now I read an article, and this was extremely devastating to see, is that one account was when people were impacted, it was like the night of the living dead, where people were like zombies. That is terrifying for our already distressed community with lack of sufficient access to healthcare, to be in a situation that literally was beyond their control and may not even have known that this was something that could potentially happen, meaning that they had no precautions around how to protect themselves in the case of an emergency, where this is clearly a traumatic emergency situation. And then lastly, I will leave with this because I want to be cognizant of time. It's really important for folks to understand what this technology entails from a robust perspective. So not from a superficial perspective, it warrants research, and not research that is induced by industry. It requires peer-reviewed research over a span of time. What should have happened was it should have been pilots, not rolling out this technology in your already overburdened communities that are already vulnerable, because it very much feels akin to experimentation, and dare I say, it feels like the Tuskegee experiments, where you have people who are not very well informed about the matters at hand, but very powerless in what happens and the lack of control in a community that many people who are trying to make profit off of will never have any type of implications or impacts because they're not a part of that community. So when we talk about community benefits, it's one important for folks to understand and have power and space to define what that community benefit is that's actually driven by community, but then two, that there is sufficient evidence, understanding, and access to knowledge around technologies such as hydrogen so that the best decision can be made about how to make communities that are already overburdened less burdened. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
I don't have
Oh,
a
okay.
presentation either, so
I'll
we're
just
good to
send
go.
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
My name is Sarah Martik. I'm the Executive Director of Center for Coalfield Justice. We're an environmental and economic justice nonprofit that works in Washington and Greene counties. I myself, I'm a resident of Washington County for most of my life. You know, I lived here, I lived in an area with the impacts of legacy coal mining. I remember the start of the fracking boom when that came to my community, and now I work for a place that centers on helping communities advocate for themselves. They're preventing or trying to prevent or experiencing environmental harm, and then also trying to push for real, sustainable, meaningful investments and opportunities for our future, because it's really critical that communities have opportunities. One thing I think I'll name for my part of this presentation is that I'm not the technical expert. We've had that. I'm not the legal expert. We've had some of that here today. But I'm really here to talk about the landscape against which we're talking about permitting an entirely new industrial process to our region. Because everything that we're looking at is like, how do we do this with hydrogen without acknowledging the fact that coal is already here. It's not dead. It's here and well. And fracking is already here. Cracking is already here. Steel is already here, and they all have impacts. I really hope that you'll kind of leave with a better understanding of that landscape, and also the understanding that this is already a lot for communities to deal with. And adding another layer of infrastructure on top of that massive build out is a huge ask for people who've already been asked to deal with so much. And a kind of case study for this, I think, sorry Quinn, you probably I know this. I'm going to talk about New Freeport, which is a small town in southwestern Pennsylvania in Greene County. In June of 2022, there was a communication incident that occurred between EQT's active unconventional well and a nearby abandoned well.
Observers of this incident saw a 30-foot geyser come out of the abandoned well, and when they called to the pad to say, hey, turn off the water pressure, stop the frac, the geyser went down. When they said, come back, you can start it up again, the geyser came right back up. DEP and EQT have been investigating this incident since that happened. Again, June 2022, we're almost at 15 months since that happened. Residents who live close by, they are mostly all on either a spring or a well because the nearest public water line is 5 miles away. They've reported having rashes after bathing, stomach upset. They've noticed an oily sheen on their water, black sand coming out of their water. Their dogs wouldn't drink the water, and the list kind of goes on of what people have experienced there. Because of inadequate statutes that we have around oil and gas development in Pennsylvania already, and what the zone of presumptions was set at, EQT was not required to provide drinking water to residents. They were not required to provide water, even though in court documents they said, yeah, it's our frac out, we caused this. And it wasn't until significant public pressure from residents who lived there on both DEP and EQT that just 2 weeks ago, EQT finally delivered water buffalo. So there was not a regulatory process we could go through. People were like, I don't know about a legal hook on this one, it's a little risky. So it literally took public pressure and public shaming of the CEO of this company to get them to provide water buffaloes. They gave out 10 so far. It's not like it's astronomically expensive, but I digress. So when we worked with residents, and just a couple weeks ago we went and met with EQT, and we were talking to them about what happened. And at first they told us that they hadn't provided water voluntarily because their testing indicated that the water was safe. But then they followed that up with, well, what we really saw is that the methane in the water sampling results came from coal, or it came from conventional wells. It wasn't unconventional shale methane. It was swamp methane, or it was coal bed methane. And then they also said they didn't test for any of the compounds they had in their chemical cocktail because they're not required to. They test for different things like sodium and aluminum and different kind of compounds like that, but they didn't test specifically for the surfactants that they used in their frac and things like that. And then the other thing that EQT said a couple times, they said it in their town hall that they had not too long ago, they said it to us in the meeting, is that the biggest brains at their company and in this industry, the people who know this area best, couldn't figure out why this happened. So first they denied that it happened, and then when we pushed them on that and said, what about this 30-foot geyser that happened? They said, well, we just don't know how it happened. So then that's on EQT's response side. Meanwhile, we have people at the DEP where residents are calling in to file these complaints with our regulatory agency, saying, hey, I'm having these impacts from what's happening. My dogs won't drink my water. I don't feel comfortable drinking my water. And literally people at DEP said, I already know. You told us already, we're working on it, and it would hang up. And then they stopped taking their complaints. They didn't file additional complaints. So there are all kinds of gaps between how our regulatory agency, DEP, and the company responded to this incident. And that is the landscape against which we're going to try to permit an entirely new industrial process. That doesn't mention the budget cuts that DEP has experienced over how many decades of disinvestment, which impacts their ability to address the volume of applications that they'll receive. That's not to mention the complexity we've heard today about the science behind it and how to make things safe, and the scope required of each of the reviews. And we've already heard today that EPA doesn't have capacity to kind of handle that kind of scope of work. But of course our state agencies have that. We want to store carbon underground in pore space, which people don't know if they have rights to or not. And they want to build out an extensive system of storage and pipelines that run parallel to the pipelines that already exist. And the issues we already are seeing happen from pipelines that carry other kinds of pressurized liquids or pressurized gases. And we, again, want to do this in a place where people are sharing with us that the experts don't really understand all there is to know about our geology. One thing that just makes no sense to me is how anyone thinks that with all the extraction we've had for over 100 years in the state, that our geology is anything that they can really get a clear picture of, because we don't have maps, we don't have any kind of formal diagrams. A lot of this stuff happened so long ago. I mean, there's my maps that have you know, they're hand-drawn. People's very sloppy writing that you can't understand is what we're going off of based on what is in the area and this specific level of substrate. And then we also want to do this in a way where we already have one industry saying, well, it wasn't me on their activities that they first admitted to, but they try to blame another one. So are we going to allow that kind of dynamic to happen still, where it's, well, it wasn't the carbon pipeline, it was the oil and gas pipeline that's nearby, or it wasn't that, it was coal after all, that kind of stuff. And the people who suffer in that kind of situation are the communities that are facing the impacts. And so I just want to close up this little portion by saying I'm very grateful that there are so many people here who are engaged on the technicalities and legalities, and they know what's going on with hydrogen and carbon capture in our state and in our region. But it's really my hope that our decision makers and elected officials are going to hear all of this and weigh all of those against the existing landscape, because that is how communities become overburdened, and that's how we have residents like those in New Freeport who are still fighting for basic things like clean water. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think we'll open it up to questions now. Anybody has one?
I have a question. This is probably for Latricea, but if anyone knows. So one thing I've been wondering about with DOE is they've been keeping the proposals secret to this point, including if we want it, just what kind of project we propose, where they're going to be located. So how is it that how can they create like a community benefits agreement plan without knowing what communities are being proposed to be impacted? Because they can't just say the community is the whole state. You have to. Where's the infrastructure going to be? Have they said anything about that?
That has been a request for several months in full transparency from the WHEJAC, where we were even like, if you're not gonna make them public, can you at least share something, like even with the WHEJAC, since that was a formal request, and that request has not been granted. We also find that to be very I find that to be very problematic, because that kind of goes against like what you're saying the community benefits process is supposed to be, is around transparency, and that's literally the opposite of transparency.
Early engagement.
Yeah,
Where's the
exactly.
early engagement?
Mhm.
If the plans are there and the community hasn't been engaged,
Yeah,
that's
and-
not early engagement.
Yeah, and I'd just like to point out on this issue in particular, it's not like keeping these documents confidential is an absolute necessity. And I say that because some of the groups who've submitted concepts to DOE have made their proposals. And I'm not talking just about marginal ones. One of them is, some of you know, I live in the Pacific Northwest now, the Obsidian Project, which is a green hydrogen project for the Pacific Northwest. And in the RISTAD rankings was in the top 4 most likely to be approved, have made completely public what they're proposing to do, which includes pipelines to carry hydrogen around a 3-state region in that part of the country. So there may, I suppose, be proprietary information that companies have a legitimate interest in suppressing, but what we're seeing is complete suppression of information, not a targeted one.
It's also kind of status quo. Like, look at the companies that are involved in the proposals that we have. Shell wasn't exactly like, hey, we're coming up here with a cracker plant. I mean, they were in the assemblies. They were saying, hey, give us a tax credit, right? They'll talk to them. They'll try to get the money however they can. But it's not like they came up to Beaver County and were like, we really want to do this. Let's talk with you, community. It was, here's our permit, and then let's do some damage control and offer jobs and go to the pancake breakfast and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's not meaningful. It's the same thing that happens over and over and over again with the same companies that are all involved in these proposals.
And we're also really afraid that when they do make it public, it's gonna be after the fact, right? Where I'm like, what good is that gonna do, like, at this point? And so we also, and this is just a personal influence, think that they're stalling for those purposes, which further, like, goes away from like that whole transparency part and like engaging with communities first, where that did not happen, and you did not honor your word that you said that you were going to do from the onset. I know that wasn't, like, it didn't answer your question, kind of did, but like, we asked and
It's
like, you
consistent
did
with
not
what
get
we
it.
found,
Yeah.
so I didn't, I just don't know how they can say that they want early community engagement without engaging the community.
It's almost like.
Now, one angle that I think particularly like folks that are in Louisiana who are likely the most terrified right now is, and it's a gamble, right, is to go a FOIA request method. But with a FOIA request, you still could be delayed. It doesn't mean that you have to, a certain timeline quickly to release like that information. They can release that information, what, 3 years later, so it's still in
We FOIA'd the
the
class 6 well applications and they redacted the locations.
Oh my God, okay.
But we do have a lot of projects we do know, and part of the reason why people are terrified is they are in environmental justice communities, these projects. But we know about them because of other permit processes, zoning, approvals,
Mhm.
stuff like that. But they've already been decided, that's what I mean, like, it's
Right.
already, the location's already decided.
And then like going back to that, like if it really was community centered, it would have come from community. If you had community members that are like, hey, we want to invest like in this project, hey, whatever organization, we want this, and if that truly would have been reflective of a true community process. But again, everything has already been decided and community is engaged on the back end, like once everything has already been set up from people that are not from the community.
I'll say too on that. We had a member who is a retired coal miner, and I remember back in 2019 we were going out to go meet with a legislator or something, and I asked him a question about CCS, and I was like, this, carbon capture, they say that this is a huge thing, and this could happen. That's what they say. And he said, yeah, we said that was going to be a huge thing back in the 80s. Like when the union went to the bargaining table and was like, hey, you could do this. That was their opportunity. Now they're just done. So that was the perspective of someone who worked in that industry for a very long time.
In Indiana, there's a proposal to bring back a power plant back into service that had been shut down since the early 2000s. And we get money from the federal government to do carbon capture. The main developer has been holding a series of community meetings where hundreds of people, evenly divided between MAGA and Bernie brothers and sisters, have been beating on the guy, not physically, but and one of the questions he was asked was, how did you pick our part of the state? And he said something to the effect of, well, I was driving around and it didn't seem like there was much here. So this would be a good place to put the CO2. He said, the people in my community, they don't want it.
See?
A moment of true honesty, huh?
It's the whole thing, not in my backyard.
Yeah.
That's what it all boils down to.
You guys might know this. Is the Department of Energy, the last time I was checking in on this issue, the Department of Energy was supposedly like, maybe somebody could explain what they're doing with community.
Is it the roadshow thing that they've been doing?
Yeah, like I feel like I was somewhere last summer maybe, and they were promising some sort of community, like meetings with communities or something, and but that was sort of it. I had not heard anything about that. Not that I've been looking for it, but have you guys heard anything about that?
Yeah, or this summer, I did this carbon removal justice program, and we met with the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office at DOE, and that was a topic that came up a lot. Another member in my program works in Louisiana on these issues and was talking about how they brought the roadshow down there and in the Gulf Coast, and essentially came there and was more talking at the people than with them, and essentially my understanding is that roadshow is delayed because they said we don't want to do the next one until you go back and like reform how you're going to do it. So that's my understanding as of right now. And another thing I'd like to add to that point is like as we're talking about community benefit plans and as they're kind of like decided before we can even like figure out what communities want. Another aspect that came up in our meeting with that Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management was that, you know, these community benefit plans are, you know, it's the first time in history in the US that they're being considered for funding decisions, which is a small step forward, but there's no, like, they're not legally enforceable, so they're not even a true agreement. So even if a company has the best plan on paper that helps them get the funding, they're not going to be like enforced, which is another aspect of concern. Like going forward, whether it's the hydrogen hubs or the DAC hubs that were just announced.
That's really important. I wanted to add to that because that was a question that I had specifically to DOE is with the community benefits, like would it be DOE that would be providing oversight and accountability to ensure that the benefits that are outlined in this benefits agreement, if it's actually being done with fidelity? It's not. So essentially they're like, nope. So once it's out the door, once they've checked their checks and balances with the actual like community benefits plan, there's literally no infrastructure to ensure that from the benefits perspective, that is actually gonna be done with fidelity. So it's pandering, like at this point, you can say all of these grandiose things that you're going to do, but there's no mechanism in place to ensure that you're gonna do it. Meaning that in an instance where there was a benefit that was not met, there's no point of recourse. Like, what does a community do if from the onset they said that they were gonna do A, but then they didn't? What are the consequences? Right now they're telling you up front like there are none, because they're like hands off. So once they get this out the door, from how I internalize it, is DOE is like, we're done, we did our job. And then another part that I've heard from DOE around why everything seems so rushed, from their perspective, they're saying because it is the timeline for how long they have to actually get the money out the door. That of course would like be congressional implications. So that's been also some of the rationale that they've been given because everything is happening so quickly and it is not as thoughtful as it should be because they're like on this impossible deadline to get all the money out of the door.
Yeah, is there a possibility that there's a changing government or whoever, the president or the new Congress decides hydrogen's terrible and they don't want to fund it? Is there a possibility that these hubs might not happen? I mean, or is this money definitely gonna get allocated?
My sense is that the $8 billion is definitely gonna get allocated, but it was mentioned earlier, I don't know if it was Sean or David, or maybe both of you, I don't know, that this is only a small fraction of like what the actual build out will be, right? And so, and I've heard too that, I think initially they were looking at like 6 to 8 hubs, but now they might be even spreading it wider across more projects. And so, you know, if you're talking only like $1 billion a pop or less for these projects, I mean, how many for these hubs? Like that might just be a single project in each place, right? And so, I see the initial allocation happening, but I think the economics are really going to play a much greater role in whether or not the hubs come to fruition as opposed to a one-off.
Yeah, I mean, to put this in context, you know, you all may remember, I'm sure you do, the Roosevelt Project report that came out from Ernest Moniz and CMU and all of those folks. And their estimated cost in the report just for the carbon capture pipeline. This isn't actually retrofitting any plants or doing anything like that. It's just the pipeline for the 13 county region in western Pennsylvania by itself is going to cost $10 billion, which is more than the whole DOE hydrogen hub budget itself. That's just one tiny element, relatively tiny element of the whole thing. In answer to your question, yeah, I mean, the subsidies that are contained in IRA are subject to change. I mean, Sure. You can repeal a tax credit. You can, there would be some legal things, and James, maybe you can speak to it, because companies will have made investments based on their understanding of the established law at the time. I'm not sure if there's any recourse in cases like that, but.
I mean, if, we would have a lot better chance if say Congress did something before the money goes out. But the chances of that happening are pretty slim.
Well, again, the problem is the 8 billion, I agree with you, because the 8 billion is going to be spent more or less right away. But the IRA tax credits only get paid out as people do the stuff. And that means that 3 years from now, 5 years from now, yeah.
Well, not to pick on EQT, because, you know, at the recent town hall, they did, you know, call the environmental movement as a whole big bullies. So, I encourage you, they have another town hall, they have a series of 4, they did one in Greene County, they did Washington County next week, and then 2 more, one in Ohio and one in West Virginia, and there's an entire section of this presentation where Toby Rice, the very charismatic CEO, goes out and talks about how awesome hydrogen is. And we know what happened with his last project, he thought was really awesome, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. They threw down on that, and they got that approval through Congress with the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't know if internally those companies that have a lot of political power in our region are gonna say, we want this, or if they're just saying, we want this because you're gonna give us money, but if you're not gonna give us money, we don't care. I don't know how that dynamic is gonna play out, but I would add that into an equation of like, is this gonna go away or not? Because they seem to want it.
This money is going to the oil and gas and coal
That was the
industries,
problem.
okay? If this administration is giving the money, a switch in parties, they're not gonna say, oh, we're not gonna give it to the oil and gas industry. This money's in the bank, it's, that they wanna spend to the big corporations that provide fossil fuels.
Now, I think one of the things, just the impression that I have is in my early meetings with folks from DOE, including one in which Jennifer Granholm was present, is that in our region, a lot of the folks from DOE came into this with the expectation that folks in our region would see this as salvation, as an economic advantage. You're gonna save our coal-fired power plants, you're gonna save our gas plants, and all the jobs that go with them. And frankly, I think they were kind of wrong-footed. I think they were stunned when they would show up in rooms at first and find people saying, wait, we don't think, no, this is not economically advantageous. They were surprised to find that they weren't universally greeted as saviors, which frankly is the, if you listen to, Joe Manchin or Shelley Moore Capito and others, that's the portrayal of what's going on here. And I think ever since then, going back to Latricea, the point you made, they've been trying to figure it out because they found that their original premise just wasn't universally shared, to put it mildly. And I think they're trying to figure out, because I think for many of them, the imperative, the virtue that they see in community engagement, and I use that term advisedly, is that they see it primarily as a means of expediting development. And I think when whoever Tom is, when you spoke, you shared that quote that basically said so, that it would be a shame if, because of community objections, projects did not go forward, rather than having it the other way around, which is put the community at the center of it and ask, is this good for the community? Wouldn't it be bad if a bad project went forward even though the community objected to it? That wasn't their primary concern. And I just go back, a year ago, right? Remember the Global Clean Energy Action Forum over at the Lawrence Center? I know you were there, Audrey, I don't know if you remember, but Team Pennsylvania and the folks from the Great Plains Institute did a presentation of their vision of a carbon capture hub for the region. the presenter. And we got to the point in the presentation where they did Q&A, and, you know, Audrey, I know you were in the room, you were sitting beside me, right? And I was just an eager beaver, right? They got the Q&A, and I just shot my hand up right away to ask, and the question that I asked was one I knew the answer to, because Ben and I had done the work a year earlier than that. And the question I asked was, they had pitched carbon capture, they had shown their map of Pennsylvania with 1,400 miles of carbon capture pipeline crisscrossing the state. And they talked about all the benefits, and I asked a very simple question. I said, you know, you've talked about how this will go into coal and gas-fired power plants. What will it cost? What will be the increase in costs associated with implementing this plan for those plants? And you know, there were, I think, 7 people, and they kind of looked around at each other, and and finally, one brave soul, and Ben, I know you noted his name and all that stuff. One brave soul chanced to guess, and he said it will probably increase the cost by between 10 and 25%. Which, as we know from what I did, is he only missed it by a factor of about 10. But the point wasn't whether he got it right or wrong. The point is they hadn't even thought about it. The solution, nobody ever looked at. This is Team Pennsylvania, this is their expert panel, and nobody could answer what should have been one of the most fundamental questions. And it's because they started this endeavor from the premise of, we want to promote this thing, we want this development to happen. It wasn't a question of whether it should, or whether this was the best way to achieve decarbonization. It was a question of, we want this to happen. Now, what do we have to say and do to make it possible? Which is the way they're approaching, in large part, community engagement. And the fact that they could not answer, I mean, you don't have to be an Einstein. Anybody can figure out $85 a ton, you get roughly a ton of CO2 emissions for every megawatt hour. You could have figured it out standing there in your head what the cost would be. It's not that hard a problem. It's just that nobody ever cared or bothered or even perhaps thought to ask. And
I would just add, though, to your question, Reed, about you know, whether the politics can change, whether the policy can change. In spite of all of this, in spite of the economics, in spite of the fact that, like, from a pollution perspective, it doesn't make sense, and from an economic perspective, it doesn't make sense. You have an issue that where the trade unions in particular are very excited about it. Because they see the skills as being transferable to what they're currently doing, right? It's very hard for them to imagine themselves if they're used to working on building pipelines, working on drilling rigs, working in power and in steam turbine power plants as part of the green energy economy. Without this, it takes a bit of a leap of faith, right? And so you see the trade unions throughout Pennsylvania in particular. You know, we're like the swingiest of swing states here, right? Supporting this, and so I would venture that it's not just a compromise to appease Joe Manchin and get his vote. It is a way to keep the trade unions whose rank and files are starting to break Republican, right? It's to keep them on the climate mitigation bandwagon, right? I think that that you run the risk if the Democrats were to break and try to strip this out of the rest of the IRA, that I think that they would run a huge risk of losing labor, and so for that reason, I think it's going to remain. It's going to retain bipartisan support through a change of administrations. We saw Governor Shapiro in his State of the State mention energy basically once, and it was cheerleading for hydrogen, right? So I don't see that part changing. I see the economic part of it playing out in communities, because that's going to be a major headwind for whether or not individual projects get built, and I think that's going to be something that is going to actually help buoy community resistance to some of these projects if they are finding that they're dangerous, because it's going to if investors are not really excited about this, that's going to make them take longer. So, but I think we're still going to try to subsidize the hell out of them.
Well, it would be much cheaper. I mean, you had mentioned earlier, the prospect of a carbon tax, which is not popular, but it would be a lot cheaper way to accomplish many of the same ends. I mean, the subsidies that are contained in the IRA, and understand, I mean, I supported the IRA as a whole, because as you pointed out, Tom, there are many virtuous parts of it, and there are some parts you just have to kind of swallow hard on. But it would in fact be much less expensive to achieve many of the same outcomes with a carbon tax, rather than basically bribing industry to do this. The problem, of course, from a political standpoint is that, a carbon tax, whether it's a federal tax or a RGGI type fee, is that especially for the power industry, when there is an alternative source of power that won't be affected by the tax, which is renewable resources, that inevitably means that the burden of that RGGI fee or tax would fall on shareholders, not on consumers. And that is, I think, the major political problem.
People don't want pipelines. They really don't want they're not gonna want CO2 stored underneath their communities. And the big problem, I think, for the plan of blue hydrogen is who's gonna buy the stuff? I mean, Sean went through that this morning. This is not happening here just in Pennsylvania, or your region. It's the whole country. It's Canada, it's all over the world. Everybody is planning to increase their production of hydrogen by a factor of 10. And who's gonna buy all this stuff? I think those are the big problems.
And it's worth pointing out, I mean, there are various estimates of how much hydrogen consumption is going to expand, and it depends entirely on the assumptions. But, the National Renewable Energy Labs, NREL, they looked at it from a perspective of both what is technically feasible, but also what is economically feasible. And they came up with an expansion in hydrogen of 2 to 4 times present use, which present use is about 10 million tons annually. So they came up to 20 to 40 million tons potentially, depending on market factors. And I point that out because that would not be sufficient to warrant the kind of investments that we're talking about. I also pointed out because, and I think, Tom, you said the report that I saw from Nettle was re-released this year as new.
Yeah, it came out last year, but they issued another press release more in March or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually even goes back to 2019. Nettle, which, based down in Morgantown and here in Pittsburgh, looked at this, and they anticipated that for Appalachia as a region, Appalachia, not just the tri-state area, but Appalachia as a region, they anticipated as much as 59 million tons just in this region. And apparently DOE just re-released that report. And what, again, the distinction is, so how can NREL come up with 20 to 40 million tons for the entire country, and they come up with 59 million tons just for Appalachia and nearby regions? The The difference is that they didn't apply any economic criteria to it. They just asked the general question of what would happen if hydrogen replaced basically all the natural gas that's getting used out there right now. And so it'll be interesting to see if that report keeps getting surfaced, because as I said earlier today, the demand problem is a big one that's becoming more front and center, especially for the proponents of these developments. They're trying to figure out ways to make demand happen. And they'll be looking for evidence of that variety to try to buttress their case. And it was demand. Again, the reason that the cracker plants did not unfold, the reason we didn't see that fleet of 5 cracker plants was, at the end of the day, there was not sufficient demand for that much ethylene and polyethylene, period. There were other factors, but there wasn't. And so it is possible that lack of demand can undo, even the most fervent wishes of legislators and industry.
Yeah, I wanted to come back just to the community benefits and community engagement piece, in part because it feels like on some level, we all as practitioners, right, it's like no one is surprised that this isn't going well, right?
Yeah.
But like everyone else is surprised that it's not going well. And I think to me, there's it's kind of exposing a bigger question, which is like, how well is our democracy functioning, right? And it's like, we're able to do this really technical thing, right? So like this is not the first time the Department of Energy is issuing funding to highly technical projects, right? But it's a large amount of funding. It's, taxpayer money, and now it's being asked to run through a more democratic process. And that's where we see this breakdown. And I feel like, we're having this very important conversation around the technical aspects of hydrogen and CCS and what is the viability long-term of the market, what's the demand, and I think that's a hugely important question. And I'm also really interested in the question, what steps do we need to take to create a more functional democracy? And I think it's this is kind of an unusual place to be unpacking that, because it is this traditionally a very engineering focused or energy markets focused agency, but it feels like it's happening through a lot of other IRA programs too, like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and some of the other pieces where there's this ask for more community engagement. And this is a very long-winded question, but basically I'd love to just get your perspectives on how can we be using these individual moments to advocate for stronger infrastructure in an ongoing way that makes it so we're not constantly trying to ramp up and down community engagement when there's a one-off project, but that we're thinking about how do we work toward building a functioning democracy so that we're not constantly finding ourselves in this position.
So I'd like to quickly jump in. I'm just gonna be real honest. If you are white and affluent and you push back, it works. When you're not, it does not. So if these projects were slated to go, like you mentioned earlier, where some folks were like, we don't want this in where I live, we don't want this in that neighborhood, and guess what? It's not gonna happen there. So I think the way that democracy in this country is acting the way that it always was. I think that if you are a person of color, if you are poor, you never had access to democracy anyway. And I think that it is becoming more glaring, like that is the case, and they can't run away from it, right? So I think the answer is kind of simple and implementation is not. Pretty much if a community, if it's a Black or poor, Latinx, indigenous community, if they say no, are you just gonna not do it and treat these communities the same way that you would treat a majority affluent and white community? And unfortunately, the answer keeps being no, right? So that's really the dichotomy that we exist in. The democracy does work for a certain group of people who are in power, but for those who don't, it works the way that our country wanted it to work. work, right? And I'm just saying that loosely, not us in here, but just like in general. And I think that's why they won't answer. Literally, it's very straightforward. Over and over again, we keep saying if the community says no, are you gonna halt and stop the project? It depends on who's asking. And that's just the bottom line. And I think until we're ready as a country to grapple with that, with the essence of racism that exists in this country, I mean, it's gonna continue to be like this back and forth. But that's literally like what the issue is. Democracy works for some people, but not for all people, essentially.
I also want to just make, sorry, do you want to add on to that?
No, you go ahead.
I just want to like just a kind of brief comment on like the way I like on a day where I am optimistic and also a little bit lazy in that I don't think we need to completely like on some days I'm like we don't have to rewrite the whole thing. We can save parts and build on it and improve it. Like there are some days where I have that optimism. Other days where I'm like yeah, it all needs to go. But on the optimistic days, I look at interactions that we've had with the Biden-Harris administration in particular around the global plastics treaty, where they've been hit over and over and over again, and people are built like our movements are working to a point where they're raising issues about Cancer Alley is overburdened, the Gulf Coast is overburdened, petrochemical development is hurting people at best and killing people at worst. And they're starting to respond to that politically. So they come out and they say, Cancer Alley is an area, like we have to help people there. We're gonna help you, we're gonna get this stuff done. But our systems are in place, like they're so entrenched, the statutes are so entrenched that the executive is like, we're trying to be like community-led and we're trying to, take community engagement into account, but there's every single process that they've ever built that doesn't lend itself to that. So they're giving this lip service because they know that they have to, movement-wise, but they can't do anything meaningful about it is I guess is the problem. So like there are definitely some places where I think, again, on optimistic days, and like we could make very significant changes and make a lot of improvements, but at the end of the day, like you said, it's so entrenched for a specific reason. That's my
I want to add another part that's somewhat optimistic and maybe a point of change. So I also think that, I know that right now, I'm just gonna say it, we have a very moderate administration. We wouldn't even get some of the things, the IRA wouldn't have been passed anyway if we didn't have a moderate administration. It is what it is. But I will also say that from a federal perspective, they have to stop being so afraid of states. They relinquish all of their federal and executive power they're so terrified of states. Clap back on these states, right? Like it's mind-blowing. They literally allow these I'm not gonna use the euphemism, racist states to undermine all of this work that they do at the federal level. We know what it is in Louisiana and places like I'm from, like Tennessee. We know what it is. And they know that too. There has to be some sort of moxie that exists where our administration is not terrified to push back on states, stop being terrified of these racist and just ridiculous states sue you. So what? Just be prepared to fight that fight. And I have not seen in my lifetime an administration that is willing to do that. But it's like being on a hamster wheel. You can keep saying all these progressive things, like you said, all this lip service from a federal perspective, but then at the state level, if you're silent, everything was done in vain. That's one part. The second part that I will say that is optimistic, I have seen the power of allyship like I've never seen before happening right now. Because it's not just with climate change, for example, it's not just the cancer rally, right, that's being impacted. It's everybody that's being impacted now. So people who may not have said very much at first that weren't impacted, now everybody is being impacted. No one is not at risk of extreme weather at this point. So I do think you starting to see people that you will never see talk about environment or climate or what have you, being a bit more vocal. I think you mentioned earlier in another comment about that public pressure and public shaming is always, it's funny, but it's always a really good tactic, especially if it's coming from people of great influence. Not just social capital, but capital. So like people that, let's keep it real, that are able to fund these candidates, right? Let's be real, because it is a connection there. If you can get more advocacy and allyship in that way, I do think that you will start to see a little bit more change, because we have, even outside of the federal government, we have seen investments in climate and environmental justice in ways like we've never seen before from the inception of this movement. So I do think that there is an opportunity for like optimism, but it is gonna require like more radical thought and both practice, not just in speak. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, like, of course, all of this is happening in the context of like a global climate crisis, right? And like, that's where the IRA money is coming from. That's where this like federal urgency is coming from the top down. And like, so in the context of like also like our democratic processes and all of that, like, to what extent do you see the climate crisis being used as justification to bypass some of these democratic processes that we might otherwise expect? And how do you see that being like talked about, either on like a big picture level or a very micro level of like, we need to do this now because we're facing this massive crisis. Like, we don't have time to engage communities in a way that like maybe you might like, you know, that type of messaging. And how do you push back against that or reconcile those things?
I think in general there's like and this isn't directly to your point, but there's sometimes this like divide between understanding how to keep climate justice and environmental justice together, and then seeing them for what you mentioned in your presentation. It's about centering people and beings that live on this planet, because like there are some wild and crazy ideas out there about how to solve the climate crisis, like let's have chemicals in the clouds and make the sun's rays not hit us so much. And it's like, holy, who came up with that idea? You know, and it also avoids the difficult political question of, can't we just stop the thing? Like you said, it's fossil fuels that cause climate change. Like, can we not just stop the thing that is causing this to happen in the first place? So I think that when people are ignoring environmental justice, that's when they get to this point where it's like, it has to happen fast. It has to be this crazy idea. And it can, you know, we have to do it because it's so imperative for the climate. But you have, like, as much as the climate crisis is here now, we also have to not put in place solutions that are going to make it even worse, or not work and, you know, cost us a lot of money. That's
Sorry. Okay, yeah, just to build on that too, because that like theme of like the for the greater good, like we have to do this so that we can solve this large like abstract issue, I feel like is also like repeating narratives and cycles of the past. So like in the Industrial Revolution, it's like we have to build all these different things and develop all these industries for the greater good. It's for the United States' growth and the economy. And if some communities are hurt or workers are harmed along the way, it's for the greater good. And I think we're kind of seeing that now as we like look at this like clean energy like revolution, as many call it, is that we like continue to see, yeah, the narrative that, oh, it's for the greater good. Like these same communities have been sacrificed before, but you can be sacrificed again because, you know, we're gonna solve climate change and it's gonna make everything better at the end. But at the end of the day, like as we saw, we got into this mess by that same like methodology of thinking. And so like, I don't think we can like apply that mindset to this crisis to like come up with the best solution. Like it's just like, yeah, going to repeat the fallacies of the past.
Yeah, I wanted to build on that with the obsession with expediency is what is so overwhelming. So for example, at the end of the day, we gotta do something. We have got to reduce CO2 emissions. I don't think that anyone is saying that, that's not up for debate. But the mechanism that we're using, and I'm saying we, like, generally speaking, is just not ideal. It's not really feasible. I even think about like throughout history, like other big transitions. So I'm super biased because my world is lead. But I even think about like lead paint, for example. That was a process. That was a big process to completely shift like a whole industry, right? it didn't happen in 4 years. It took a significant amount of time, like, for us to get to this point now where literally lead is banned in paint, even though you still have the residuals of that. But even with that investment over time, it was over time. But this mammoth project, like, people are trying to get us to be like, yeah, we're into it, like literally within 2 years barely. So it's not really realistic with the approach as far as time. I think with any technology, there's always risk. Even when the wheel was created, I'm sure that something went awry. But with any technology, there's going to be risk. But in 2023, we should be more thoughtful, like as a country, to approach this in a different way, as opposed to not really knowing like what the impacts are, but let's just throw money at it and see what sticks. It's kind of like what this feels like. And unfortunately, it is happening or will happen to people that were already in such great risk anyway. When you said that sacrifice part, it is a sacrifice, right? And it is not by your own decision. Going back to you said like about democracy, that's the very thing. It's not an opt-in, it's forced. Like consistently the same groups of people over and over again like have to make this sacrifice. Even with the Inflation Reduction Act, that was a big sacrifice and compromise. So even from environmental justice organizations before the IRA was passed, we warned everybody that this would happen. We were like, yes, all this suite of really good things. Yay, great. But literally, WHEJAC organizations foreshadow the very things that we're talking about now, like be careful, like with this investment, because it's gonna make us super reliant on fossil fuels. But even when we think about the reliance on fossil fuels, that's gonna take a culture shift. So it goes back to censoring people. So even though we collectively know that we need to get away from fossil fuels, we need to reduce CO2 emissions, we're still not centering around people. If you just say, for example, right now today, everybody get rid of your fossil fuel and car. Everybody get an electric vehicle. Who's got money for that? You know, like it can't be like a quick off and on switch. And I think that's what's missing is like the realism, like of all of this being realistic about what the everyday, day-to-day impacts are on people. That's the missing part. Is we're not, it's like a super fast race, it's a sprint, but it really kind of is a marathon. Like you have to be really strategic and that's not really happening.
To your question, you got me thinking when your reference to electric cars, right? The environmental justice issue is not just simply limited to fossil fuels either, right? Like we're starting to see fights starting to happen over extraction of critical minerals in the United States for the first time. We've been able to kind of keep those issues out of sight and out of mind, and it allows us to think, okay, well, we can just get rid of fossil fuels and we'll be fine. Each of the issues will go away. That's not the case. I mean, I think, and this is coming from someone who drives an electric car, whose organization definitely supports electric vehicles. It just illustrates the point that like the community engagement process, the need for like actual truly democratic systems is going to apply regardless of which climate solutions we are investing in right now. And I think unfortunately, and this is I think one good thing about the IRA, and even though it caused some heartburn among like EV advocates with incentives to kind of reshore things, like if we are not actually like having to deal with the entire supply chain of the solutions that we're promoting, we're going to make bad decisions. So, and we're going to have to, we're going to have to figure out this democratic process no matter which path it is.
Also, really quickly, I think that we don't really talk about agency-wise, is the Department of Justice too, needs to have the federal government, these other agencies back a little bit more than what they do. So I think about instances with the EPA where they do like fight back and are prepared to combat, particularly like states and like industries. But then you have like the Department of Justice that are like, that can decide like, we're gonna move forward or no, let's just not like bother with that, which makes it really difficult for agencies like the EPA, which is the regulatory agency. If we're gonna do this and do it right, then entities like the Department of Justice needs to have like their fellow players, right? Like needs to have their back, and I think that is an untapped area as well, where it kind of backs everybody into like the same corner where you can't really escape, where it makes you do lip service. Like you may have all the best intentions, but you hit this roadblock and now you kind of feel like you failed everybody along the way because you can't hold people accountable, right? Like you can't really enforce your own rules to a certain extent. So I think that also plays into like that really centralizing democracy is even from like a governmental perspective, like allowing people to execute what little power that they have to the fullest extent without it being interrupted. So that's also a point of contention as well. That was a cool question.
Right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to our panel. So it's 4:15 right now. We have the room until 5:30. And let's take a 5-minute break and come back if anybody has any final closing questions.